What's Your Why is brought to you by Wyoming Humanities. Our mission in this podcast is to inspire, engage, and inform, bringing you relevant, timely topics about our shared human experience. Please go to thinkwhy.org and sign up for our newsletter. That's thinkwhy.org, THINKWY. And please subscribe to our podcast so you never miss a show. Thank you. When I first invited Bob Berky to join me on this podcast interview, I was very interested to learn about his new project with Global Arts Corps called Children's Radio Exchange. Children's Radio Exchange is creating a community of young people's voices and stories from around the world. Stay tuned to learn more. But I also learned of Bob's very interesting life story and journey as a renowned theatrical clown. He uses his art of clowning to bring his audience to the realization that we share a kindred experience of being human. The clown's honesty is to say things as they truly are, because that is what we will truly laugh at. Today, we welcome Bob Berky. Today, we welcome Bob Berky. Bob Berky has performed at major theaters and festivals throughout the world. He is an Obie Award winner. His work has been featured at the Kennedy Center, Lincoln Center, Smithsonian Institute, and art centers throughout the world. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you.
You have a huge list of awards and places that you've created and performed. But before we go there, I really want to know where you grew up and what started you down a path of theater.
All right, as best as I know. I was born in Richmond, Virginia. I lived there about 7 or 8 months. The hospital I was born in burned to the ground. So I figured at a young age that I should probably leave town. My father was a musician, my mother as well. And we moved to Michigan briefly, and then he went into the Air Force as a band director. And that began my journey all over the place, because we moved every 2 or 3 years. So I grew up in Michigan, in Florida, on Long Island, in Hawaii, Kansas, California. I said Colorado, I think, Massachusetts, all of that before I was out of high school. I would say that I learned a number of things from that experience. One is that all people are equal, but not treated that way by other people. Air Force bases were typically multiracial, and everyone lived together, went to school together. And so I was always shocked when I left the security of that environment and went out into the quote unquote real world and saw so much animosity and towards other people from people. I grew up as a musician, my father and mother being musicians. I started on the trumpet at an early age, and it was demanded of me by my father that I spend an hour every day by myself in a room playing the trumpet. I did rebel against that occasionally, but then after a while, I found it to be wonderful. And then in 7th grade in Hawaii, I had a beautiful, beautiful music teacher. I can't remember her name now, but she was just a wonderful person and a stunning individual. And she asked the band, she said, as I recall, "We have so many trumpet players, and we have no one playing French horn. Would anyone like to try?" And I immediately raised my hand to please her, and I began playing the French horn, which I loved. It's a very difficult instrument and has a beautiful sound when you're good enough at it. Otherwise, like many instruments, it sounds like some wounded animal or a bird in a swamp. Anyway, I left Hawaii midway through the 7th grade, and I continued to play the French horn through my next three movements toward graduation from high school, movements in terms of geographic placement. And then went to the University of Rochester and studied English literature, but also studied at the Eastman School of Music, on French horn, which with a wonderful, wonderful man named Milan Jancic, who's no longer alive. So by then I was heavy into French horn and English literature. And but I finally got to the point where I knew I wasn't going to be a horn player for my entire life, because I did some concerts. I was, hired as a college student to play with various symphonies in Canada. And as I went there to play, I just felt that the members of the orchestra, many of them were not very happy. They were just there and they weren't going to go anywhere. And so after one of those concerts, I got back to the University of Rochester. I put my horn in its case and I never took it out again. I started auditioning for some theater pieces, but I wasn't that attracted to theater because it was very cliquish in college. I was an athlete, so I was a soccer and baseball player, and I also ran cross country. So I did a very physical type of movement even when I was toying around with theater. I got involved with a couple of guys who had studied with a very important American teacher of movement. His name was Tony Montanaro, Italian-American. He had lived in New York for many years, but then had moved to Maine and established a school in South Paris, Maine. I went up there and met him, a wonderful man. Then I went back to university. I was also at that time in the NROTC, Naval Officers Training School. And this is during the Vietnam War, mind you. My summer of my freshman year in college, I was on a naval destroyer in the Pacific Ocean, DD-789, the Eversol, a World War II tin can. And so here I am sailing around the Pacific as a midshipman on this destroyer. And I'm thinking to myself, boy, what are you doing in the military? Don't you know better? You just spent the rest, the early part of your life related to the military. So at the end of that cruise, the midshipmen were asked to do a talent show for the crew and the officers of the destroyer. I was the top midshipman on that cruise, and I spent a lot of time in a lot of different departments. My most enjoyable one was being on the radio deck, the communications deck on the destroyer. Most of the guys there were black, and they would play great music at night and dance. And so I was up there dancing with them a lot. And they also had developed their own kind of semaphore, which no one could understand but other black guys on other ships who they communicated with. So I loved that, and I learned that semaphore. It was a form of dance movement. I was exposed to many things, and when it came to this talent show, I had by then had a dinner with the captain, and I found this man to be totally incompetent, and I was really disgusted by him. And I let that be known to a couple of other officers, and they basically took me aside and said, you need to just keep quiet because, you're well regarded here, but there's nothing we can do about the captain. Well, at the talent show, I decided, since I really didn't have any talents, that I would just do a parody of the captain. And so I did this whole scenario of the captain dealing with various things and bumbling about, and the ship's crew were howling with laughter. And I happened to look back at the back of the group, and there was the captain. His face was like a cold stone.
Oh, no.
And so I thought to myself, I'm doing a good job. And at the end of that, the applause and laughter was so great, I just thought to myself, this is powerful stuff. This is really where I want to go. This is the only way to talk about this. Even the officers can't talk about it, but I can through this. So I got off the ship, went back to the University of Rochester, and resigned my commission. And then began doing theater. Luckily, a new professor came to the university. His name was Stefan Rudnicki. He was just out of Yale Drama School. He was doing serious stuff, serious playwrights. And because he was Polish, we were doing a number of plays by a man named Witold Gombrowicz. Very, very interesting work. So I got hooked into that. And then eventually, when I graduated, I did 2 years of alternative service as a conscientious objector, working with kids in the urban area, doing research on egocentricity in juvenile development. And then I went and studied with the man I mentioned earlier, Tony Montanaro. And I went up to Maine to take a 3-week workshop, and I stayed for 4 years.
Oh, my.
And I studied with Tony, and I became part of his company, and he was like my second father. So I learned a lot from him, a great deal from him, and not only in classes and in performing, but in watching him perform and watching him teach. And he took me as his performing partner to various gigs around the country. We performed with the Corpus Christi Symphony doing L'Histoire de Soldat, which Stravinsky's Tale of the Soldier, which I had done previously at the university. So, I think that's why he took me along. But so I got very close to him in those 4 years, and the company. There were 9 of us. And I taught in the summer, had another guy, Fred Garbo, who was a very fine performer. He and I taught in the summer. People came from all over the country to do a 3-week intensive in comic theater with us. And of course, I'm just learning as I went along. After 4 years there, I had to leave. It wasn't feeding me the way I needed to be fed. Nobody's fault. But I got the opportunity to do Estragon and Waiting for Godot back at the university with Stefan Rudnicki working. And so I left the company at that point, went out on my own, started a theater in Rochester with a guy who had worked with Tony as well, Tony Montanaro. And after 2 years of this guy came up to me. He was English. He worked at the professional theater in Rochester called the Jiva Theater. He came up to me and said, you should go to Edinburgh and because I had developed a whole solo show by then. You should go to Edinburgh and do your show. I said, where's that? And so that was my beginning. I went to Edinburgh in the 1970s. I performed in a church basement, doing 2 90-minute shows a day, sometimes for as few as 2 or 3 people. And then at night, I would perform at the Fringe Club, and that's how I got my reputation. So the second year, I was asked to perform at a large venue. And at that one, I was seen by agents and newspapers in London, and things just kind of took off from there.
I'm really curious because just studying your bio and your background, and you also have trained people in being clowns. It's really interesting because you're doing a lot of serious theater, but you also have a very spontaneous sense of humor. Were you born with that spontaneous sense of humor, or is that something you developed throughout your life?
I just have a mind that doesn't think before it speaks. And I get that from my mother.
Is she witty?
She was a Kansas farm girl who became a pianist and met my father when she was going to CWC, Colorado Women's College, long, long ago. So, she had a tongue that would cut you in half and you wouldn't even know you were bleeding.
Oh, my. That's what I love about the art of clowning is that you have to have this very quick wit.
Well, that's based on being awake, not always considerate, but awake. Because clowning is, in its core, in its history, it was always there to try and reveal the truth of things. And laughter, if you really think about it, laughter is a response to understanding. Someone hears a joke and says, I get it. Well, that moment of getting is the moment when you laugh, but it's also the moment of epiphany. It's a moment when the world for a second is illuminated and you are inside the illumination. In Zen Buddhism, there's a book called Zen and the Comic Spirit. It's an old book. I don't know if you can get it anymore. I have 2 copies, which I will not give away, but it talks about the moment of understanding, and that's when people laugh. And if you think about a joke you've heard, of course, the other thing about comedy or humor is based on usually a reversal. Aristotle was, as far as I know, the first one to understand this, and it's called an Aristotelian reversal. So that A leads to B, but it doesn't lead to C. It leads somewhere else. That's the reversal. And I'm not much of a joke teller, so I really can't think of an example to tell you. But it's true of almost any good joke that it has a reversal in it, and that's where the truth lies, in the understanding of the juxtaposition of the setup and the reveal. And Aristotle was the first to kind of codify that.
Well, it sounds like you discovered that in yourself when you did this whole satire about the captain on the ship.
Yeah, I discovered a lot there. I discovered that it was a good thing we were leaving the ship the next day.
Hurry up and get out of here.
That's right. But that's, when you think about medieval times, the court jester, the king's fool. A quick story about that. There was a king who had a fool in England, and he was, his right-hand man, and he was the one who told the truth. One day he said something to the king that was the truth, but the king didn't want to hear it. And so he said, all right, that's it. I can't handle you anymore. So you've got 24 hours to get out of this country, and I never want to see you in England again. I don't want to. You cannot step foot again on the soil of England. So the fool, being no fool, left and went to France. And he bought 2 buckets and filled them with French soil and sailed back to England and walked down the streets, the main street of London at the time, walking on these 2 buckets of French soil. The king heard he was back, had him dragged into the palace and said, all right, that's it. I'm off with your head. And he said, Majesty, you cannot. I am standing on French soil. And the king looked at him and just went, oh, all right. And he was brought back. That's a pretty brave fool. I told this story to a Buddhist monk who was a dear friend of mine. He used to play flute for the Dalai Lama, and he also played in some pretty well-known jazz groups in the United States back in the 80s. Anyway, I told him this story, and I said, pretty amazing fool, right? And he stopped for a moment, then he said, a very wise king. I stopped and I thought, oh my gosh, I have totally lost the bigger picture because I'm wedded to the fool, so to speak. And it was a very important moment for me, not only in how one develops one's work and one's perspective and consciousness, but you have to look at a story from a number of different perspectives. And Nawang really kind of set my head straight on that one.
So you've been on quite a journey in your life, and just
haven't we all?
I think we all do, for sure.
Yeah.
I feel like you have set out in a way to discover things about human nature and humanity that maybe other people don't take the time to delve into. But it sounds like, and reading your bio and the things that you've done, that has been part of your learning and journey and joy. So that's why I really wanted to talk to you about this new project you're working on that you had discussed with me the other day. And I really wanted to hear about your journey and kind of like jump to where you are now and the work that you're doing now and how what you've done before has influenced and informed what you're doing now.
In the broader context, most of my work as a solo performer has to do with interacting with the audience directly. And if I'm known for anything in the performing world, it's how I interact with the audience, which is somewhat different than normally done. That is, a performer will bring someone up on stage and then use them to make a scenario happen, a scene develop, but often at the expense of the individual from the audience. They can be made fun of. And of course, that's easy because if you're brought up into an environment that you know nothing about, you're kind of a standing idiot. Whether you're brought into an indigenous situation where they know how to do something and you have no idea what's going on, or whether it's a political party, trying to castigate you or make you look silly. These are the environments that humans use to denigrate each other. However, in my performance and work with audience, I do the exact opposite. In order for me to be successful in these scenes that I create, which are very funny, they have to be successful. And so my success is predicated on their success. And what that does to the chemistry of the moment is that makes the audience, rather than watching one of their own and saying, boy, I'm glad I'm not up there, they're watching one of their own be incredibly successful. And the applause at the end is totally different. It is fulfilling. It is complete. Mm-hmm. And I am merely the conductor.
Right.
And so that has created years of very satisfying work. Audiences that at the end would come up and say, I haven't laughed like that in a long time. And I would always say, well, that's too bad. Then they would look at me like, what? And then they go, no, you're right. You're right. To me, clowning is a way of embracing. You can take 2,000 people and all of a sudden at the end, everyone has embraced, figuratively. And I'm not a California kind of juicy juice type of guy. So it's not that kind of kumbaya moment. I'm not really, something about that just doesn't go for me. But to create a dynamic situation where everyone, unbeknownst to themselves, feels one with everybody because they're all laughing at the same moment, at the same thing, creates a very important unification that's more and more necessary as we go on. So that leads to what I'm doing now, which is I'm working with Global Arts Corps, which is a nonprofit organization founded by Michael and Jackie Lesak. And Michael, he was a child prodigy. I think he had his PhD in psychology when he's like 20, 21. He went from psychology to starting the Colonnades Theater in New York City, which became a very famous theater. And they wrote a piece called Moliere in Spite of Himself, which was an amazing hit in New York. But then he went out to Hollywood and directed television shows like Everyone Loves Raymond, Taxi, the Bob Newhart Show, lots of different stuff. And then he decided he didn't want to be in Hollywood. He wanted to effect more change. So he started Global Arts Corps, which would go around to various parts of the world where there's much conflict, like South Africa, Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, if you're Irish, Bosnia, lots of places. So I became involved with them. I worked with them in South Africa a bit. I spent a number of years working on a piece in Cambodia, which toured 19 circus performers, brilliant young performers, great actors. And we developed a piece about the genocide and about the effect of the genocide on the youth of today in Cambodia, many who don't even know what happened. And they don't ask those questions for a number of reasons. So anyway, we developed a piece there, which we did all throughout Cambodia. We took to Rwanda and did it there because there's a genocide there. We performed it for 23,000 Congolese refugees on the borders between Rwanda and Congo. Then we brought it to Boston and it had an incredible American premiere And we brought in Cambodians from nearby Boston. There's some great communities there. And then COVID hit. So end of that. And all the Cambodians went back home but then struggling, to get enough food for their families.
Wow.
So we've been doing a lot of things in a lot of parts of the world. And we have an amazing staff of performers who we work with and who I work with. And right now, this new project is a matter of creating groups of kids in various parts of the world that create stories about their lives, their communities, and what they see as being the future of their world. And then communicating those stories to other groups of kids in other parts of the world, creating bonds between, let's say, two pods of kids, through radio, nothing visual. So they create stories, they listen, and then they send stories back. And they send back questions. They send back answers. And eventually, what will happen is that we'll have these kids in two different areas create a story together.
Okay, I have a question before you go on.
Yep.
How do they find out about each other? How do you meet? How does one kid from one place in the world connect with another? And you're not using any social media, but you're using radio. How are you bringing them together?
It's a little like Tom Sawyer and the Fence. During COVID, I was feeling isolated, but I thrive in most isolation. But, that was an existential moment for the planet. And so I began by interviewing kids just to see how they were doing. And of course, how did I do that? Well, I called a friend who was locked down with his family, and he had kids, and I interviewed his kids. And then they would say, "Oh, I have a friend in Texas." And then I'd interview them. "Oh, I have a friend in France."
Mm-hmm.
And pretty soon I was interviewing kids in France, in Russia, in Spain, in England, in Romania, all over the place. So to long answer to your question, so what we did is we identified a few places that are a little out of the beaten track. One of them is an Indian reservation right here at Wind River. And I started working with the kids there and talking to them because that's its own environment. It's a very special place. And I love being there. And it's just got its own feeling. So kids on the res. Then Arben, who's one of the actors who I've worked with in Cambodia, he was born in a small village in Kosovo called Iznic. So we went there. And we started with 20 kids. If we were there 2 weeks, started with 20 kids working on this stuff. And by the end of the first week, 70 kids showed up. It's just like they all wanted to be part of it. So we worked with them for 2 weeks. And now I'm going back there in November. And we're bringing in another wonderful performer, teacher, Nick Bahrain, who's from South Africa but lives in LA, and he's an actor, and you can see him on some shows. But his father was the man who worked with Mandela to create the Truth Commission. So
interesting. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. It's amazing. So Nick and Arben and I and Michael and Jackie will be in Kosovo for 2 weeks in November, doing the next step of the story creation. Meanwhile, we've been also working with kids on an island off the coast of Brittany the island is called Berky. And wonderful kids everywhere. And we're going to Peru with this. We'll be going possibly to other places in the United States, Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland, because the troubles they're still there. So that's how we make connections, and then other connections just appear. That's a beautiful little phrase and an image that says, "Leap and the net will appear."
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I live my life, I guess.
I'm trying to picture this in my head. So when you're interviewing these kids, well, first of all, how old are they? And secondly, what kinds of questions are you asking them that, bring out a response? and
Well,
want
first of
them
all,
to get engaged?
yeah. The ages are 9 to 12. And that those ages were picked, and it may vary a little bit, but they're pre-adolescent, pre-teenage, really. So a lot of the hormonal conflict and is on the horizon. Secondly, once you ask them a couple of questions, you don't need to ask them much more. And the other thing about this project is we don't want to shape it. We don't want to give them an adult perspective and then have them react to that. We want them to tell stories they want to tell. And now you can't certainly get away from the influence of adults, family, etc. But I think a lot of times we manipulate kids because there's certain things we wish to hear. And that has nothing to do with our work.
I get that, but
yeah,
you still have to start the conversation.
Yeah, you do. You go in and say hi, and you ask them to tell you some stories about their childhood or what happened to them the day before yesterday. You ask them if they have any questions for kids on the other side of the world. You don't ask them to ask certain questions. You just say, if you had the opportunity to ask questions to some other kids, what would you ask them? And we have a setup of two old 1940s microphones and a Tascam situation. It's very portable, so I can take it to the res or wherever I go. And we sit them down in front of these microphones, and they go to town. And then we do some exercises about storytelling and improvisation, just so they can loosen up and realize that they can do anything they want. And then they start devising stories. And they also ask questions, which we record. And the questions from the kids in Kosovo, I then took to Belle-Île. I had the kids in Belle-Île sit down and listen to these questions. Now, the questions were in Albanian, translated by the same kids, because the kids in Kosovo are bilingual for the most part, English and Albanian. So then kids in Kosovo would translate into English. And then, of course, not all the kids on Belle-Île speak English, so we had someone translate into French, and then they heard it. But the important thing was to see them leaning into the tape recorder when they heard Albanian for the first time. It was magical. It was like they were hearing strange music, which, of course, is what language is. It is a strange music. So that in itself hooked them. And then, of course, when they had the questions, then they started taping or recording their answers and their own questions. So you start this dialogue back and forth. The important thing about not having it be visual is that we live in a world that is much, much too visual. And we now know we cannot trust it. In fact, there's very little we can trust. Everything can be manipulated, and of course has been for centuries, but now to a point where even what you're seeing is not believing any longer. And so I maintain that we need to go back to the art of listening. And in listening, you then can imagine. And also your powers of discernment, your powers of critical thinking are developed by listening and going, is that a voice I can trust? And so the listening part of it is not only very important, but very useful in developing the citizenry of the future.
What is the title of this project?
This is called the Children's Radio Network at this point. At one point, we called it Radio Islands. So it's right now it's the Children's Radio Network. And so once we have established a bridge between two groups of kids, then we'll bring in a third who can then share with both of those. And the web, I describe it as a capillary action. This will just spread and spread and spread. And because there's no visual involved initially anyway, it's much easier to make those connections and to produce those moments for them to share. And we're talking about storytelling. We're talking about, and when you think about it, you asked me to tell stories of my life and what has shaped me. So that story may or may not be interesting, but it is kind of a timeline of the growth of my consciousness for whatever it is. And I think that's what we're most interested in. However, we exist in especially this particular society, where they're cranking out stories hand over fist, and most of them are boring as hell, and they're not worth looking at. And so at that point, I want kids to go, wait a minute, I have something more important to say. There are better stories than this. Do you want to watch reruns of Gilligan's Island, really? No offense to Gilligan or anyone who was in that, but it's like, where are we? And when we think about, I was talking to someone about this last couple of days. What came out was that what we call history is often, it's totally manipulated. What we call mythology has remained the same since the beginning of time. And that it's in mythologies of many cultures where we find the kernels of truth that actually are more important than all the historical hubbub. And look what's happening in this country, where now people are saying, oh no, slavery was actually very positive for some people. This being said by white people who, I don't know, I really have a hard time connecting with that kind of thinking. But in any case, history is often and always manipulated, usually by the people who win. But mythology has not changed, and there's a really important reason for that, because it's closer to our spinal column and our heart. So I got off track, perhaps.
No, that's really interesting. I guess in other cultures they wouldn't call them mythology, but they're actually stories that.
That's right. And I was just reading a review of Reservation Dogs that had 3 seasons and now is over. But I watched the first season. I don't have those platforms to watch them, but what a breakthrough that was. And of course, some of the characters on that, and they purposely wanted to make sure that these story characters from their culture were there, like the Antelope Woman or
right,
anyone, not other ones. Because when I work with the kids on the res, they too bring up, oh yeah, my dad saw Antelope Woman once. He told me he saw her. Part of that is here I am, a white guy going on the res, and I've made some very close friends there, but I'm still a white man on the res. And so people who don't know me, they say, oh, there's another white man on the res. But I find with the kids, as I gain their trust, they would tell me stories and there'd be this twinkle in their eye, like, yeah, we're telling this to a white man. And do you get it? And so it was quite wonderful. So that what do people believe and what do they say can be 2 different things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I think all cultures have those stories.
Yes, they do.
And it's a lot of times it would be a way for my grandma to explain something to us. Like, this is why this is this way because of of La Llorona or whatever.
Yes, right. Well, and some of the stories are highly sophisticated. Mm-hmm. There's one about Coyote. I'm not going to tell you the story, but this is the story which explains why we cannot return from the dead. And it's a Coyote story, and it has to do with Coyote's behavior in the presence of death, and it's a poignant story, beautifully done.
So it must be very interesting, Bob, that these kids that you're working with and talking to on the reservation or in other countries, they have a very probably youthful way of explaining things, which is probably very beautiful and very innocent. So I'm sure it's so refreshing for you.
It's like walking in nature, in the nature of humanity. It's the kids that are the new trees coming up. And they have sometimes fresh eyes. I think part of the problem is, You can find teachers that are always kind of harassing them, wanting them to say things a certain way. We were in Kosovo on Independence Day, and so the school had a big celebration, and there were a couple little girls who recited poems, and I couldn't understand them because they're in Albanian, but I could tell by the nature of their faces that these were serious poems. And then I asked Arben, who obviously, having been raised there, he speaks 3 or 4 languages. And he said, yeah, it's about the war and remembering people. And I realized that little girl herself may not have, she wouldn't have picked that poem to read or to recite, but her parents or her school administrators, they needed to hear that because they had a direct relationship to the war that had taken place in the late 90s. They may have lost brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, who knows? And so the need of the adult takes precedent over the child. And then you say, well, yeah, so what about the history? Don't they have to hate the Serbians? And I go, was it heinous acts that were perpetrated on both sides and whatever? Yes, but if we just keep hating each other, then we just keep killing each other. And interestingly enough, this morning I heard the story of a woman whose son was killed by this other boy. He went to prison, but when he got out, she was there for him. And basically, like Father Ubald here in Jackson, she raised him and made him her son, even though he'd killed her son. And they lived next to each other. And she said at one point, when you graduate from college, that will be him graduating from college. When you get married, I'll be there because he never will have the opportunity to get married. It was an amazing story. And then this was taped some years ago, and then today they had another one. Now she's actually going into dementia. This boy now has a wife and 2 kids, and she remarried, and but the relationship is so powerful and unbelievable. And it's you just go, wow, through such pain and suffering, how do we get to a point of understanding? Which means to stand under.
That's a great story. You'll have to send me a link to that. I want to read that, or I want to learn about that.
It was on NPR. So
it was? Okay.
Yeah, it was StoryCorps. So if you go there.
Okay. It was StoryCorps. Okay. I'll look it up.
So, what happens, as you say, when I'm with these kids, I'm back in the nature. But here's another quick story. So Vishna, this Cambodian circus performer, brilliant performer, and in rehearsals, very defiant and tough. And he came from a really bad background, not bad, just difficult. Only mother and 2 sisters, mother mentally deficient, living off of what he makes being a circus performer. And then during the rehearsals of our piece, he has a motorcycle accident. He wasn't wearing a helmet, and he went into a coma. Didn't think he was going to even make it. And eventually, he got to the point where he could be in a wheelchair. We went ahead and finished this production. It was done in Phnom Penh, which is the capital of Cambodia. He came there, and we saw him, and he could somewhat relate to us. But things just went downhill for him after. And the last I have heard, he's begging on the streets of a small town on the border between Vietnam and Cambodia.
Oh.
The reason I bring that up is that stories can be real. And that's the stories we actually want to hear. I don't want to hear a made-up story. I don't always want to say, oh, that's an Aristotelian reversal. Now, plenty of reversals in life without having to go back to Aristotle. So the realness of it, and in some cases, there's nothing that can be done. The story has its own way, which then puts it back in the category almost of mythology. Because you can't go and then change mythology,
Mm-hmm.
Sisyphus, he's rolling a rock up a hill. It's not all of a sudden one day someone says, "Here, let me help you with that." No, that ain't going to happen.
Ain't gonna happen.
No, Prometheus, Icarus. There's a beautiful painting. Of course, Icarus is the one who put on the wings, son of Daedalus, I believe. Anyway, and he flew up too close to the sun, right?
Mm-hmm.
And crashed in the sea. I don't remember who made this painting. It's from the medieval times. I think it may be called Icarus, but in this painting, in the foreground, is a man plowing a big field. And way in the background is the ocean, way in the background. And in the middle of this ocean, you just see two little legs sticking out of the water. It's the moment he crashed into the ocean.
Right.
But it's tiny. It's way in the back. It's insignificant in the sense that all the rest of life is going on. So, you're going to get your wings and fly to the sun. Dude, I'm busy.
Dude, I'm busy.
Right?
Oh my gosh. Well, that's a new way of looking at that.
I got that straight from Aristotle.
Well, Bob, it's been great talking to you. I want to learn more. I want you to keep me up to date on, and I don't know if there's a way to do it, but I would love to, as you progress in the Children's Radio Project, I would love to learn more. And even maybe there's a way that we could put together, some of the stories and just air them and listen to all these kids talking about their lives and their background and how they're sharing.
That will happen. Yeah.
Okay. I would
also, in the meantime, in October on the 19th, I'm doing a fundraising event here.
Okay.
For the project. If anyone's interested and would like to come and hear more about it and maybe donate. We have a $50,000 matching grant right now, which is really wonderful. But so I'm trying to raise money from the community of donors here for this project that is, this is a 10-year project.
Where can people find you? Do they donate online? Do you have a website? How do people find you?
Well, Global Arts Corps.
Okay.
.org. And Global Arts Corps is GLOBALCORPS. Oh, I forgot arts in the middle of that.
Right. I wrote it down.
Good. You can see how good of an administrator I am.
So, if we go to Global Arts Corps, there's a way for people to give online.
They could do that. And if they're interested in coming and hearing more about this project, and I'll show two little bits of film, one from Northern Ireland, the project we did there, and we are going to continue in this one, and also some footage from the Cambodian project.
And where is this taking place?
It's going to be in Studio One at Dancers Workshop. Babs Case is involved in it, and Jade Walsh is kind of leading the charge. I'll be there to speak. Okay,
excellent. All right. Well, it's been wonderful talking to you. Have a beautiful day, and let's keep in touch and talk again.
That sounds great. Thanks, Emmy. And it is a beautiful day.
Yes, it is.
And,
go take a walk and look outside.
Get on my bicycle.
Right. Or go on your bike. Get out. Get outside.
All right. Take care.
Right. You too. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why? Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with support from Wyoming Community Foundation and generous supporters like you. To learn more, go to thinkwhy.org, subscribe, and never miss a show.